A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien. Chapter 5. For one thing, the colonel said, they've built themselves a zoo. That wouldn't seem surprising at first glance. I mean, the villa is for recreation, and the Russians are great animal watchers. They love circuses, and yet, when you think about it, why bother? They have the Washington National Zoo, one of the world's biggest and best, only a mile from Embassy Row. They can be there in minutes. Fergus said, maybe. Still, people do keep pets. What do they have in their zoo? Or do we know? We know. By we, I mean one of the U.S. government agencies. The term, I believe, is infiltrated. We have an informant in the Russian embassy. As we may assume, they have one in ours. He goes out to the villa. He tells us they have 2 rather mangy leopards, a small brown bear, a wild boar, and a smattering of monkeys and apes. Not a very impressive collection. There seems to be a turnover among the simians. They keep dying. What's the connection between Helmuth Schultz and the zoo? Not clear. The colonel opened his briefcase and took from it a folder containing a sheaf of papers. He handed one of the papers to Fergus. Here's a list of equipment recently purchased by the Russian embassy. We're reasonably sure it's at Villa Petrograd in the zoo. The list was a typed order form on the station. The list was a typed order form on the stationery of a laboratory supply firm in Baltimore, Biophysics Equipment Incorporated. Fergus scanned it, disinterestedly at first, then curiously, finally with incredulity. This equipment at a zoo? He said. The idea is ridiculous. So we thought. What would a zoo want with an X-ray spectrometer? Or a Bailey centrifuge? And all these Martel reduction jars and petri dishes? That's all microbiology. That's the same equipment we've been using here with the bee virus. I know, said the colonel. But stop a minute. Consider it the other way around. What would a microbiologist want with a zoo? Of course, said Fergus. Test animals. Of course. But there's another question. How could the Russian embassy order this stuff? Wouldn't they realize how odd it looks? The colonel considered, and then gave away another secret. The fact is, they didn't order it directly. They bought it through a friend, an American. They have quite a few of those. Not traitors, really. Not even necessarily communists. Just people who, like Russians, get to know them and see no harm in doing their friends an innocent favor. This one might not be so innocent. There was a plausible story. The equipment was to be sent to the University of Moscow for use in the Soviet Academy of Medicine. But it wasn't? Why should it be? Half the stuff on the list is German manufacture. It doesn't show, but it is. Why buy it here to ship to Moscow? Fergus studied the list again. It's a wonder they didn't buy an electron microscope while they were at it. I can even guess at that. They're very expensive, as you know. My guess is that they'd completed that phase of the work at Novokuznetsk before they packed. Dr. Schultz set up and sent him over here. My guess is they'd completed that phase of work at Novokuznetsk before they packed Dr. Schultz up and sent him over here. Do you know what that phase was? No, that's the trouble. If it's been published, it would be ultra top secret. We get some of those papers eventually, but not all, and sometimes not until 2 years later. Do you have papers on any of Schultz's recent work? Yes. In General Vasilovsky's reports, Schultz appears. And this whole time I've been saying Schultz and it's Schutz, so let's change it back to Schutz. Schutz appears as Group 17. 4 years ago, he was still working on genetics. Basically the same problem that attracted the Nazis, but with better methods, modern tools. In short, controlled alteration of the genetic code, the DNA, by means of a virus, by radiation, by transplanting nuclei, by chemical mutagens. Our bee virus project, said Fergus. Can I see his reports? For obvious reasons, said the colonel, I can't carry copies around with me, but you can see them if you'll come to Washington. Colonel, I'm not going to Washington. Fergus stopped, hesitated, and was lost. But if I should, what would I be expected to do? Nothing hard, nothing dangerous. All we want from you is an educated guess. For that, we can offer quite a generous per diem, a consultant's fee. Say for a month, maybe 2 months, your option. First, you talk to some people in state. First, you talk to some people from state. Second, talk to a man from CIA who knows quite a lot about Dr. Schutz and his papers. Third, take a vacation. Rent a cabin near the river. We've got a cabin lined up, and it's cheap, in fact free. Then go fishing. Fishing in this weather? Fergus looked out the window at the gray-brown snow. In Washington right now, the dogwood is blooming and the bass are biting. They're biting particularly well along the shore of Villa Petrograd. Allie and Willis followed behind Big Henry's tractor, gathering worms. Allie carried a used coffee can into which she had crumbled some dirt. They had to stay close behind the tractor because most of the worms, exposed by the big plow blades, slid quickly back into the damp earth and disappeared. The engine was noisy and they talked a lot, but each time Willis extracted an unusually large worm, he would hold it up joyously for Allie to admire. Finally, she said, shouting over the clatter, "Willis, don't hold them. Just put them in the can. I know they're big." He looked up at her and thought that her light hair, shining loose around her head, looked like a cloud in the sun. He liked everything Allie did, but he particularly liked her hair. And her room. When the coffee can was full, or full enough, they took the worms to her room. It had a secret doorway, Allie said. "Willis, it's not a secret. Everyone can see it." Still, none of the other bedrooms had one. It was there because Allie's room on the ground floor, the other bedrooms were upstairs, had once been a screened porch with a screen door leading out. When their father, John, helping, had enclosed it, he replaced the screen door with a door of glass. It looked out on a narrow sweep of lawn, and beyond that, the woods. Willis thought it must be like sleeping outdoors. Also, one could leave and enter without anyone else's knowing. Through this door, they took the worms. "When can we go?" "Saturday." "Oh, Allie, why can't we go today?" "You know the rule. We can't go to the river by ourselves." "Then let's get John." "John can't go. He's studying for finals." "I'll ask him," cried Willis, running for the stairs for John's room. "It's no use," Allie called after him. "I already did." She put the can of worms under her bed. Willis came back. "But the worms will all die." "No, they won't. It's only 2 days." "Maybe we can go tomorrow." "John says Saturday. Anyway, Mother will be home, so she can go too. But I'll tell you what." "What?" "Tomorrow, right after school, we'll go and see if they have a new animal. I looked yesterday, but they didn't. But they might tomorrow." Kublitz's office, in the basement of the enormous spired and domed stone structure that was the center of Villa Petrograd, stood entirely underground and had no windows. As Dr. Schutz entered, he sniffed with distaste the faintly rancid smell exuded by the stone walls and the bare cement floor, a smell which clung to Kublitz wherever he went. It was a sour place, shadowy despite the fluorescent lights in the ceiling, a suitable habitat for the sharp-faced KGB agent behind the steel desk. 4 heavy safes stood along the wall behind Kublitz's desk, each with 2 dials on its door. Dr. Schutz had seen many such safes in Siberia, in Novokuznetsk. No one person was permitted to know the combination for both dials. Thus 2 must always be present when a safe was opened. The safes were vented, and at the push of a button, a gasoline geyser in each would turn it into an incinerator. Without greeting, Dr. Schutz handed his autopsy report to Kublitz and requested removal of another chimpanzee from the zoo to the laboratory. Kublitz, who was under orders to supply him with apes as needed, was nonetheless surly. "They are not free, you know," he said. "They are expensive. You have killed already 9. Kublitz, half Polish and half Russian, spoke no German. Since Schutz spoke no Russian, they addressed one another in English. Kublitz's English was imperfect. Dr. Schutz was excellent. "The animal was in ill health when I received it," he said. "So you have said before." "So it has been before. In any case, that phase of my research is complete. The mortality rate will now decline." "So complete, and with what result?" "That will be made clear in my report to Comrade General Vasilovsky. Your report to the General is submitted through me," Kublitz reminded him. "The preliminary experimentation," Dr. Schutz spoke rapidly so that Kublitz would be unable to follow, "has been to determine variables and constants pertaining to survival rates, ratios in viruses and streptococci of known virulence and resistance when subjected to standard procedures used in water purification processes. These parameters have now been ascertained within viable limits. Maximum variability plus or minus 2.5%. He paused and added, in simple terms, Comrade Kublitz, we have learned how many germs and what types you must add to the water supply to be sure some of them come out the tap at the other end of the pipe. He was pleased to see Kublitz look shocked at so open a declaration of objectives, and that he looked quickly at the office door to make sure it was tightly closed, which it was. The Americans, Dr. Schutz thought, had a word that described Kublitz well: weasel. It matched both his face and his manner of speaking. Tell Walter to apply at the zoo gate at 6 o'clock, Kublitz said. We will provide another ape. I don't suppose there is a possibility of obtaining a dozen rats. I have said before there are no orders pertaining to rats. One does not keep rats in a zoo, Kublitz added nastily, nor humans. My preliminary reports to the general will be completed next week, said Dr. Schutz. In it, I will point out that completion of this research, as well as any possible implementation, will be impossible unless results can be tested on a human subject. However carefully done, the work will be inconclusive. The genetic controllers are different, the cell structure is different, the chromosome number is also different. Point out what you like, Kublitz shrugged. Moscow has ruled against it. He smiled, the smile of a weasel. Unless General Vasilovsky would care to make a suggestion that occurs to me. What is that? Was it possible Kublitz had a useful idea? That perhaps you could test the results of your experimentation on yourself, or possibly in the interest of science, young Georg Walter would volunteer. Dr. Schutz felt his neck stiffen with anger and a pulse hammered in his right temple. In the long years in Siberia, he had learned in such circumstances to remain absolutely still until it subsided. When it had done so, he said pleasantly, Perhaps, after all, that will not be necessary. We will see. Please have the ape ready. It is especially important. And that is the end of chapter 5.